Welcome back to the pharmaphorum podcast. In this episode, I speak with Ethan Drower, co-founder and CEO of Cite Medical Solutions. Our conversation dives into the complexities of clinical evaluation reports, or CERs, and European Union Medical Device Regulation (EU MDR) processes. Ethan sums up the secret, so to speak, for writing a highly effective CER, noting that it takes a certain kind of person to see the true art and benefits to medical writing. There are a few hiccups in the audio, sadly, and apologies for this, but the discussion merits listening to nonetheless for its insightful learnings and guidance on this space. As ever, thank you for listening. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Ethan Drower, co-founder and CEO of Cite Medical Solutions, a company providing full clinical evaluation report, or CER, services and industry literature review for European Union Medical Device Regulation, or EU MDR processes. Today, we'll be discussing optimizing clinical evaluation reports for medical device compliance. Before we begin, though, Ethan, with your background in software engineering and regulatory affairs expertise, perhaps you could tell listeners a little bit more about your journey to today, doing what you do with Cite Medical.
Sure. And yeah, thanks for having me, Nicole. As you mentioned, I'm a trained software engineer and I've worked in a whole host of industries over the last 15 years. I made my way to the medical device and the regulatory space about 8 years ago. And the reason for that was pretty much I was tipped off through my father. And he was at the time working for a manufacturer that was feeling the preliminary pains of EU MDR. And that's what kind of tricked flipped on the light bulb in my head of we can likely do this better. The regulatory world is not a flashy industry. It's not one that often sees dramatic innovation and technical prowess, right? And so we kind of saw the opportunity together to say, we can improve a lot of these processes and thus offer more competitive services at a more affordable rate, but more importantly, a higher quality service to these medical device manufacturers clearly struggling with the workloads. So, the company was born out of the prediction that EU MDR was going to cause a lot of pain. And, for me personally, I am drawn to whatever's kind of the juiciest challenge that I think I can have a competitive edge on solving. That's what I'm really interested in. And I've kind of found my home in the regulatory world and even further in the device world. We do some pharma stuff as well, but this world of compliance of how do we actually produce safer things, but how do we do it in a way that doesn't stifle innovation? The key part, right? Safety is incredibly important, but so is being able to push the limit. So if we can get better at recognizing safety, we can move faster in terms of innovation and creation. So I see them as kind of like yin and yang. They're vital to each other. You can't just take a staunch opinion of we should have more of this, we should have less of this. They need to be in some kind of balance. And I think technology enables us to really speed that up. So yeah, and here we are today.
Absolutely. I like this notion of yin and yang and balance. But if we just sort of go back to the other notion of a juicy challenge, a clinical evaluation report, or CER, is a document that exposes a clinical assessment's conclusions of a medical device. It must provide evidence which conveys, as you say, safety and regulatory compliance for the manufactured product in question by structuring an analysis of pre-market and post-market clinical data. And there has been significant evolution in the European regulatory landscape over the past 10 years, particularly in terms of requirements for clinical evaluation, driven in part by a series of medical device failures, which fueled a perception, particularly amongst regulators and clinicians, that clinical evidence for medical devices was not receiving sufficient scrutiny in Europe. So I was just Ethan, could you perhaps dive into some of those failures, first of all, for us?
You're absolutely right that the landscape has changed significantly when it comes to clinical evaluation standards. Some argue that the reaction to a lot of the kind of bigger headlining failures was an overreaction, and we can talk about that in a little bit. I did some quick searching, and off the top of my head, I remember over the last 10-15 years, gosh, we're getting old. It's been at least 15 years for some vaginal mesh implants that caused major issues. And I think one of the bigger ones was the birth control implant, but I can't remember who makes it, who made it. I should have looked up their brand. But over that period of time, there were many more that weren't as fabulous headlines that still hurt a lot of people and still affected a lot of patients, and that's really what matters. And EU MDR and IVDR was, some would contest that it was the kind of the reaction to these widespread failures of manufacturers to either disclose or to just properly test and validate the safety and the performance of their devices. And whether or not that's true, whether it isn't an overreaction or whether it was justified, the reality is that MDR is here, and it requires a lot more effort and a lot more data on the manufacturer. So, politics aside, that is the reality. Is you as a manufacturer, you're going to be spending a lot more time, a lot more effort, and a lot more budget on proving the safety and the efficacy of your products.
Absolutely. As you say, these are people, these are patients. We're dealing with human bodies, human lives. So safety is all important. And needless to say, understanding the requirements, therefore, of a medical device CER is critical. The European Union Medical Device Regulation, MDR, 2017-745, was first released in 2017 by the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. And that regulation is intended to ensure a high standard quality for any medical devices that are produced in or supplied to member states of the EU. And MDR requests an evaluation report of the safety and performance of medical devices that must be completed through the compliance of the General Safety and Performance Requirements, or GSPR. So in this respect, can you go into any finer details of what such an evaluation report entails, Ethan?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a complex document overall. I mean, on average, you're not really writing one of these reports that's going to be less than 80, 100 pages. So there's a lot of detail that goes into it. So I'll give you the broad strokes of the CER, the big components. We generally break it down into 4 stages. The first would be the scoping. So what's our plan? What are we going to do here today? The second step will be identifying all pertinent data to your device. That can come from many sources. That can come from post-market data. It can come from your internal clinical data. It can come from running big clinical investigations. It can come from survey data. It can come from published literature. That's very important. We'll talk about that later. So all the data, anything related to your device that can be useful, we need to address it. You cannot selectively choose data. If it exists, it needs to be reported effectively in this section. The third section is going to be your appraisal. So great, we've taken this block of massive data. Now we need to actually determine what of it is acceptable and relevant, and how relevant is it. So certain data is weighted as more valuable, right? If you run a very specific study about your product testing this exact thing, that's far more valuable than a customer survey. But all data needs to be accounted for and appraised in that section. And in your fourth section, this is pretty broad, but it's your analysis of that data. So what are we concluding? What have we determined? What is the data telling us? And is the data telling us, hopefully it's telling us that what we stated in the scope in terms of what are we trying to prove here with our product, hopefully the data is telling us that we in fact can prove it. And that's kind of the thought process behind your CER. So you're going to make your claim, you're going to tell us our product does this and it does it safely in this way, right? X percentage of time it's going to work. And then you're going to provide your data, you're going to assess your data, and then you're going to hopefully draw a conclusion, like, writing any kind of essay or research paper. And you're going to use that data to hopefully prove your hypothesis, prove your claims. That's the general flow of that document. Obviously, the sections can go on forever. There's, we'll probably talk about the GSPR, and that checklist, but that's the gist of it. How's that sitting, Nicole?
That's sitting well. It is prompting a few questions. Within that document, you mentioned noting all data, no selective choosing of the data. If that data is perhaps showing negative potential, how does that affect the sort of possibilities that, let's go towards the morale of putting the document together? I mean, obviously this document, its purpose is to take in the risks and show the safety, really. Can you tell me more there?
Yes. So what do you do if you come across data that doesn't look great? Right? What is the decision? And from a company perspective, right, from a manager's perspective, you need to take off your marketer hat, and you need to be a lot more objective when it comes to your CER. So a big misconception that we have sometimes when we work with clients is that they want their CER to be this document that just pushes the headlines, right? Pushes the benefits of their amazing new technology and talks about how great and superior it is to everything else. And if you do that, you're run into trouble because it's very clear that you're not being objective. So, to more directly answer your question, how do you handle that data? You have to discuss it, and you have to, in your analysis section, you have to address it, report it, and then determine how big of an impact this has on your claim of this device is safe and effective. Negative data or adverse events, they're not a bad thing. They're not a thing to be minimized in this report. Obviously, we don't want them in reality, but in the context of the CER, it's your responsibility to raise them and discuss them. And even if they are bad or negative, right? It's not always black and white. Even if they are negative to what you're trying to say, you can then take the opportunity to justify, okay, what is our plan to either address these in the further design, or how are we going to continuously monitor this to make sure that this is just a blip and this isn't a massive trend of an issue of potential failures. So it's really more about, it's about objectivity, obviously, but it's also about understanding that this document isn't meant to be your best foot forward always. You need to, if you don't provide the negatives, and there's always a negative in medical device, there's no perfect device. If you don't do that, you're going to run into a lot of scrutiny, because then the auditors are not going to trust your objectivity. If there's no bad news, they're going to be suspicious that, hey, maybe we can't believe anything that they're saying in this report. Maybe now we have to check into the validity of everything that they've claimed. And that's when you really start going down the rabbit hole of increased expenses, audit responses, extra man hours trying to reprove and justify every little thing. And that's really dangerous. So did that answer your question? That was long-winded, but it's an important one.
No, absolutely. It does answer my question, and it prompts more questions. So moving from that essential trust from objectivity and honesty, I suppose we can call it, you mentioned two words there, trends and expenses. So I was wondering if you could expand on both when it comes to the putting together of this report?
Yes. I mean, from a budget standpoint, the new CERs, the EU MDR CERs and the IVDR PERs, which are performance evaluation reports, they are a significantly heavier lift. Whereas previously they weren't an afterthought. I don't want to minimize it too much, but they you could hack them together and get by just fine. So an average quality regulatory employee could, put it together in a week or two of ad hoc work. And now the timelines are 5x that. And it requires a much more experienced set of eyes to perform them. It's no longer just okay, let's put our data together and let's say what the product does and show a picture of it and tell us what products it's like and good to go. That you have to be it's a far more involved process. So budget wise, you have to expect your labor costs to balloon on these. Doesn't mean that each document will cost you $100,000 to do. But, for reference, the average CERs for our writers, all the things included, you're looking at 60 to 80 hours instead of 20 to 30, which is what a lot of people put into before. So that's a pretty substantial bump, talking about the risks, right? And kind of the trends of how the reports are going. Most manufacturers that are continuing to try to just kind of push these documents through are running into extreme pains when it comes to the audits and the revision rounds. And we've often found that most manufacturers that we've worked with, if they get stuck in the audit rounds, they end up having to redo most of their stuff anyway, which essentially doubles their costs, right? And cuts down on all of the internal bandwidth because most regulatory departments are not just selling in Europe, they're doing other things too. So they're coming into a lot of bandwidth issues, if that makes sense, of their staff. There's just not enough information to go around. And if you're not big, you don't have the luxury of just increasing headcount at will. Even the big companies don't really have that luxury anymore. So overall, you're figuring a multiple of expenses, and more importantly, the significant reduction of your team's attention if they need to address the CER. So you just needs to be planned for.
Yes, I mean, planning across the industry is always important, but when it comes to this, let's call it the art of writing such a report, it really is the finer detail that counts. I just want to go back to what you sort of made note of public and published literature. I was wondering if you could expand on the importance of that.
This is the biggest change, in our opinion, in the clinical evaluation side of device submissions. And it is the requirement of a systematic review of published literature that is relevant to your device and or similar devices. So previously, companies, if they had some articles that they found, they kind of just included them in their submission and they said, hey, we had these articles and the results were pretty good. That no longer flies. And a company needs to have a reproducible literature review that covers pretty much as broad as you can go. So, globally is the expectation. And that's really the reason we got into this business, was because we felt that we could build a software platform that made this very labor intensive process much easier, in 10 times easier, in fact. So it's a process of reading. You have to collect potentially several thousand articles from different sources. You need to review them all, you need to assess them all, and then you need to generate an output that's usable in the argument of your clinical evaluation report, right? And then, by the way, every step and action that you take during that process has to be documented so that somebody else could reproduce it. So it's not as easy as just throwing a bunch of articles into an Excel sheet and going to town. You need to have an auditable process. That's really why we became so obsessed with this industry is because we saw this as the most inefficient process that could possibly exist, but also a critical one. So that's where the opportunity for us is. We can solve a problem and have a huge impact, with technology. And that's kind of been our angle. But the process itself it's arduous, it's intense. And as a manufacturer, you need to budget for this as well. It's not just about the compilation of your CER, it's about the compilation of your data and the collection of it. And that's a major component. That takes almost as long as it does to write the whole CER document itself.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podbean, and pretty much wherever you get your other podcasts. Just search for pharmaphorum and press subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us as well on X or Twitter and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.